Hello, welcome. Let's talk about my 10 favorite books that I read last year in 2023. So a couple caveats for this list. There was a couple rules and restrictions I placed on myself. Number one, I'm not going to be including any rereads on this list. I did reread some books last year, so those are out. Also, I'm not going to be putting any manga on my list. This is just books, just written books. I'm going to have a separate kind of video and list where I talk about manga, so those are out too. If there are multiple books in a series that I read and wanted to put on this list, I just lumped them together into one spot. That really only applies to one spot on this list, but still. And these are going to be listed in order of how much I like them. So they are in ascending order of, again, how much I like them. I read so many good books this year. This list was actually harder to curate than my worst books this year, which I'm really thankful for. I'm glad I read so many good things. So I'm very excited to be able to talk about these books. And the other thing I just want to disclaim before I get started on the list is that I'm not going to be going over what any of these books are about. I just feel like I'm not the greatest at describing books, I feel like, so I just want to leave that up to the plot blurbs that you can find on Goodreads or Wikipedia or Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. I'll just be probably giving some genres or tropes or stuff like that just to take up less time in the video. I'm going to start out with a couple honorable mentions. Like I said, this list was very hard to curate, so I am extending it out to some honorable mentions. First of all, we have Peter Pan by J.R.R. Barrie. So Peter Pan already had the nostalgia factor to me because I grew up watching multiple adaptations of Peter Pan. So I already really have loved the story of Peter Pan and been familiar with it for such a long time. But this is my first time ever actually reading the book. And now having had consumed it in written form, I just love it all the more now. I loved the book so much. I loved the themes in it about growing up and childhood. The beginning of it is very exciting. The middle is adventurous, and the ending just really hits you hard in the heart. It's so imaginative and magical. It's such a sweet book. It somehow manages to be both heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. I love the tone that it takes. It is just through and through a true classic, and I loved it. The next honorable mention is The Kingdom of Sweets by Erika Johansen or Johansen. I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name. This is a Nutcracker retelling, and it really only takes the retelling angle for the first third-ish of the book, and then after that it kind of morphs into its own thing. But it is a very dark reimagining of the Nutcracker. I wouldn't say this book has a strong plot, although the plot did keep me pretty interested. I couldn't stop thinking about this book every time I put it down. I wanted to keep picking it up again when I couldn't and keep going and seeing where the story was going to go and what kind of twists and turns it was going to take. But like I said, it just didn't have a strong plot. So it was interesting because usually those types of stories I just don't really love all that much. But with this one, I think it really worked because the main character was so interesting and well written to me. The book is written in first person POV, so we were really privy to a lot of her inner thoughts, and she's given so much depth that it just made the whole book so good. This was also a really good book to read during the holidays because it really has that kind of wintry Christmas time atmosphere to it. If you are interested in The Kingdom of Sweets, I would recommend reading it sometime in the wintry season. Okay, now into my official top 10. Coming in at number 10 on this list is Wundersmith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is the second book in the Nevermore series, which is a middle grade high fantasy series. It's kind of a cross between urban fantasy, I guess, and high fantasy, but it is set in a secondary world. So, it's somewhere in there. I really, really loved the first Nevermore book already. And this one to me just felt like a step up even. It was a great follow-up. I loved seeing more of Nevermore. I loved learning more about it and even seeing more of its history and lore. There was a great expansion of the world in this book. The mystery also in this book, there was a mystery aspect that was very compelling and it played out in a very exciting way. I didn't know where things were going to go. And I think the author did a really good job of raising the stakes along the way. I also love Morrigan. She is a great protagonist. It's very, very easy to sympathize with her because she's so sweet and she really tries to do her best and tries to do the right thing. And this world kind of hates her and is really mean to her. And so it's just, like I said, it's really easy to sympathize with her because she's going through a lot here. I like the lessons she kind of learns of self-acceptedness and self-assuredness in this book. That was very relatable, even as an adult. Above all that, I love Jessica Townsend's writing. I really appreciate the Nevermore books so far, the two that I've read, because I really do believe that they can be enjoyed by adults. They're not just for kids. She puts so much magic into her words, and everything in these books just feels so whimsical and fun. So it's very, very fun to read. Everything I love about middle grade fantasy is here. And if Jessica Townsend were to write any other fantasy books, I would pick them up in a heartbeat. All right, next, number 9 is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a classic vampire story. It's written in the late 1800s, I believe. It's really short. It's more novella length than novel. I honestly didn't expect to like this one at all, but it's short, so I decided to give it a try. I actually read it around Halloween time. I thought this would be maybe a nice kind of spooky book to read. When I thought about reading this, I kind of had flashbacks to Dracula, which I read the previous year, and I really did not have a good time with Dracula. I didn't enjoy it very much. It wasn't my thing. So I just didn't have high hopes for Carmilla, but I wanted to try it anyways. And I actually, in tone and what the author was attempting to do in each book, I found it really similar to Dracula in that way. But I think this worked where Dracula kind of failed, in my opinion, and a big reason for that is the word count. Carmilla is so much shorter, and so the story works so much better. Dracula, to me, was just too wordy. It was too long, and I got so bored during it. And Carmilla, on the other hand, at the end, left me wanting more, which I think is better than the other way around. I really ended up liking Carmilla. It told such a complete story in just like around 100 pages, and it didn't overstay its welcome. It didn't ever get too wordy and long-winded. Even though the page count was so low, the author still managed to put in just a ton of dramatic buildup and suspense. I loved the mystery elements here too. I think it's really obvious where the story was going, but even so, I was still interested in Laura, the main character, uncovering things about Carmilla bit by bit. I think the author set up a really good, creepy atmosphere, and the sapphic undertones in this, I don't know if you even call them undertones. They're kind of overtones, but either way, they were just beautiful. The building of the relationship between Laura and Carmilla, the main characters, was just done really well. It was perfect. I was interested in them and invested in them while at the same time feeling this kind of dread about their relationship, just feelings of dread in me. It was a really good setup on the author's part. So yeah, I just can't believe how much I love this story and how much I got invested in it despite it having such a low page count. So Carmilla was very good. All right, the next story on the list is The Magician's Daughter by H.G. Parry. This one's kind of a cozy historical fantasy. This story employed a soft magic system, and I think that made the entire thing feel just so magical. It imbued the story with such a sense of wonder. It was enchanting. There were so many fun descriptions in this book of the magic and how it worked and how people could use it and all the little things that the magic could do, and it was just really fun. This was set in the early 1900s, and I think that setting worked really well, at least for me, because it made it feel kind of close to home, because that was only like 100 years ago, and at the same time, it still felt otherworldly because it was 100 years ago. It almost feels like a different time, but not. I don't know how to describe that. It sounds like it doesn't make sense, but it does in my head, okay? The writing also really set the tone of this time really well, and I think all the locations, whether it be a kind of remote location or a more urban setting, were really aptly described, and I could just tell exactly how they looked. I do love this time period. I am a fan of the early 1900s. I think it's just so interesting. So I might have some bias there, but I was really interested in how the author set each scene. So it was very fun to me. I also love the main character. She had a really well-written coming of age arc in the book, and she actually felt like a teenager, which is what she was supposed to be, instead of in a lot of other books where it feels like a teenager is actually written to be kind of an adult. This girl felt like a teenager. I also like the relationship between the main character, the teenager, and her guardian figure. It was very sweet. And at this point in the year when I had read this book, it was the first book in a while that I had read that I really felt all this stuff about, and it was just kind of a heartwarming book. And like I said, it was so magical. So when I finished it, it just made me feel like I stepped out of this other magical world. This is exactly a book that I picture when I hear people say they want to be transported to other worlds. The Magician's Daughter just fits that bill in my head so well. It wasn't a scary world. It wasn't a dark world. It was just a very fun, magical, fantastical world. And I love this book. Okay, the next book on this list, number 7, is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This book is kind of urban fantasy, although it is a fictional city, but it still is urban fantasy. I would classify it. It's also kind of superhero fantasy. It's contemporary. It starts with the characters, the two main characters in college, and then it kind of follows them into adulthood. This book was a wild ride from start to finish, and I absolutely loved it. Schwab did a great job with the pacing here. It wasn't too long and it held my interest the whole way through. This story was interesting because it was told in a non-linear timeline, and sometimes that really doesn't work in my opinion, but here I really think it did. I wasn't ever confused. It was really easy to follow, which is usually my biggest complaint when it doesn't work, is that it's just very confusing. But here, I think it was very clear. I feel like Schwab very meticulously decided how she was going to tell each part of the story and from when in the timeline she was going to pick each chapter to take place in and what information she was going to reveal. I don't know. She did it very, very well. It seems like it'd be super complicated to write a book like that, but it was really well done here. The two main characters in this book, Victor and Eli, were both very, very compelling. I was fascinated by both of them, honestly. I liked that they were both very morally gray, too. And one was definitely more morally gray than the other. I won't say who, just in case. It might be kind of obvious from the book blurb, but I'll just keep it ambiguous. But the fact that she made even the protagonists, the main protagonists that we're supposed to follow and sympathize with, she made them very gray, too. And not morally superior was really interesting to me. They were both so complex, and Schwab getting really deep into their thoughts and their motivations and the way they ticked was, again, so interesting. It was so engaging. The plot itself, too, was very exciting. Like I said, this was a thrill ride all the way through. It definitely kept me on my toes. I think the side characters were also really great, too. Very interesting, very well done. I'm trying not to give too many details about this book so it doesn't spoil any sort of surprise, but everything was just really well done here. Okay, next, the number 6 book on this list is The Loneliest Girl in the Universe by Lauren James. This book is a sci-fi thriller. It's young adult. If you decide to read this book, I would recommend not reading the plot blurb, which I know is a very strong choice for a recommendation. But if you're just looking for a thrill ride, again, a thriller set in space, and it's, about a teenage girl, pick this book up because this book was amazing. So intense. I flew through it, which is saying a lot for me anyways, because I usually don't read books very quickly. I'm a pretty slow reader, but I got through this in 2 days, I think, which is really fast for me. The plot was really engaging, and the way that information in the plot was revealed bit by bit was so compelling. We were always given just enough crumbs to satisfy my curiosity while always keeping me wanting more information, wanting to go on to the next chapter, wanting to keep reading, turn the page so I could see where everything was leading to. I also love the main character in this one. This is another example, just like The Magician's Daughter, of a teenage girl that I think is so believable and so relatable. She was written so realistically to me. I could see myself in her shoes several times through the book. So that definitely helped getting me to sympathize with her. Because of that, everything that happened to her really tugged at my heartstrings and helped me to connect with the book even more and even deeper. Lauren James really knows how to write one hell of a thriller, and this book was another example of a thrill ride. All right, moving on halfway now. The next book, number 5, is Guards by Terry Pratchett. This is the 8th book in the Discworld series and the first book in the Discworld kind of sub-series, The City Watch. This book was a blast. It was so unique, as with pretty much all of Discworld I've read so far. There were classical fantasy elements throughout the book, but the execution of them was just so interesting and new and kind of subversive. So wholly original and very entertaining. Pratchett's ability to take these common things and kind of breathe new life into them is masterful. All of the Ankh-Morpork City Watch characters were so endearing. I loved them all to death. Protect all of them at all costs. I especially loved Sam Vimes, and Carrot. They were just the best. I'm so excited to see them in more Discworld books. I think Vimes is definitely one of my favorite Discworld characters. Even though I've only read 6 Discworld books, I would still count him among one of my favorites so far. And I've only seen him in one book. Well, no, that's not true. But he's only been a main character in one book. I just loved his arc in this book, and I loved how flawed he was from the very beginning. Pratchett does such a good job of setup and payoff. I think he's my favorite writer as far as setup and payoff so far in my life that I've ever read. The setup alone in this book was really fun. Very, very fun. But then the payoff at the end of everything he sets up in the beginning and in the middle is just so satisfying. Also, the humor. I gotta talk about the humor. I mean, that's one of the biggest draws of Discworld, I feel like. This book was so freaking funny. I think this is the funniest Discworld book I've read. I laughed out loud several times while I was reading this, and that's really rare for me, especially, hello, my cat just jumped up, especially with books. I never do that. So I think that's something special that Pratchett got me to laugh out loud, guffaw even, while I was reading this. Really, really great Discworld entry. Okay, the next book, number 4, is The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This is a middle grade high fantasy book. It's kind of fairy tale-ish. I have seen this book described as Ghibli-esque, and I feel like that is such an apt comparison. The way that Studio Ghibli movies are very calm and relaxing and really reflective and creative, yet also very complex and emotional at the same time. The way they manage to get right into the heart of human experiences, even when told through a fantasy lens, is exactly how this book felt. There were so many magical and whimsical elements here, but the book cut right through to my emotions and made me feel things so deeply. As I said, this book is so magical. Just so much magic and wonder abound here. If you're looking at all for that kind of book, I'd recommend The Girl Who Drank the Moon. The author's creativity in building the world and all the little magical elements she put in were just so fun. There was so much quirkiness in this book, and not in an annoying way, but in a really fun kind of way. It just made the book feel very much in its own world. It was distinctive. It was special. The writing was also gorgeous. It was very pretty, but it never really crossed into that purple prose kind of territory, which is good for me because I'm not really one for purple prose. I don't love it. I also love the themes of this book: love, hope, sorrow, growing up. I love the characters and all the relationships and how the relationships were explored between all of them. I know that sounds really broad, but it'll make sense if you read the book or if you read the book. I also love the differing storylines in this book and how the author managed to connect them all at the end. Not to mention the little twists and turns throughout the book that were really exciting. This honestly had a more complex story than I would have expected for a middle grade, but I was all here for it. It was so good. Okay, moving on. My third favorite book of the year was Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This is one of the standalone stories set in Joe Abercrombie's first law world. It's a revenge story. It's also the first of the standalones that were published. So I actually have a dedicated video to this book where I talk about it for like 20-ish minutes. I will link that if you're interested. But overall, this book was fantastic. I loved it. Obviously, it's number 3 on my list. I never wanted it to end, while at the same time, I was really desperate to see how it was going to end. As always, Abercrombie's character work is masterful here. He made me care so deeply about everyone while at the same time presenting them all as very realistic, flawed individuals. I loved how I could understand every character's motivations and decisions all the time, even if I didn't necessarily agree with them in any given scene. I don't think I could even tell you my favorite characters in the book, because I just love them all so much. They were all so good. If I had to list them, I would list almost all of them probably. Everyone's arc was very satisfying, very well written. All the characters themselves were very well written. As far as the revenge plot goes, that is a kind of an overdone plot trope, but I do think it was done really well here. It was very interesting the whole way through. I think Abercrombie made us care enough about the main character Monza to want to see her get her revenge, and I wanted to see how she was going to go about it. And I liked seeing how the revenge affected her physically and mentally. Her internal journey throughout this book, throughout her revenge seeking, was very interesting, and I think it evolved in a really good way. This had a much more focused plot than the original First Law trilogy did. I was kind of surprised, but pleasantly so. Also, Abercrombie's action scenes are always so good. They're very clear. I can tell what's going on as far as the action very, very well. He manages to capture the chaos of widespread violence very well. So yeah, Best Served Cold was a great book. Okay, second to last, my second favorite book that I read this year was Stardust by Neil Gaiman. This is a standalone book, and it's also definitely very much in the fairy tale side of fantasy. This book is another one on my list that just felt so magical. That is one of the best praises to me that I can give a fantasy book. That's why I read fantasy. I want to feel that sense of magic permeating through the book. For me, if I can come away from a book and just marvel at that feeling and how I felt while I was reading it, that is top of the line for me. In this book, Neil Gaiman's writing was so beautiful. I loved how he told this story. He charged the book with so much magic and whimsy. It was so fun to read. The characters were also really fun and endearing. I especially like the journey of self-discovery that the main character goes through in the book. It's similar enough to a coming of age arc, which almost always gets me. There were also a lot of classical fairy tale elements present here, and that's something that gets the nostalgia factor in me because I grew up watching a lot of the, classic Disney and Golden Age Disney princess movies. So very nostalgic story elements. I love that Gaiman doesn't shy away from those classical tropes and elements or apologize for them, but instead just embraces them fully, and he weaves them into the story just wonderfully. Stardust is a perfect homage to classic fairy tales. The world building in this book was basically everything that I love about middle grade fantasy, but written for adults, so it was just the perfect combination of stuff, and I almost felt like this book was just tailor-made for me. I loved it so much. This is another example, just like when I talked about The Girl Who Drank the Moon, of multiple storylines that seem not to be very connected at first, but then Gaiman weaves them together by the end so wonderfully and so surprisingly too. He pulls them all together in such a creative and interesting way. And the fact that he did this in just a 200 odd page book, this book was really short, is so impressive. I didn't have to ever wait too long to see how everything was going to come together. So this book was so freaking enjoyable. I loved it so, so much. It was my second favorite book I read last year. So let's move on to my favorite book of the year, which was technically Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien, but I'm lumping the Two Towers in too because I loved the entire Lord of the Rings so much, but I only read Two Towers and Return of the King last year. So, The Lord of the Rings. This is another one that I have a standalone video of on my channel, so I will link that if you're interested. I talk about it more there than I probably will here, but I absolutely loved The Lord of the Rings. After I finished this book and my first wrap-up I ever made on my channel, I predicted that Return of the King could possibly be my favorite book that I would read for the entire year, and lo and behold, it is number one on this list. I would definitely say I liked that one better than Two Towers, but both were phenomenal. Return of the King made me feel more than any other book I'd read this last year. I came away from that book feeling just the most emotions that I had felt out of any other books. It was incredible. Tears streamed down my face so many times during Return of the King. And that's more than I can say for a lot of books. Well, it's more than I can say for any other book that I've read this past year. Other books did produce tears, I'm not going to lie, but none as much as Lord of the Rings. Before I started the trilogy, I really wasn't sure what to expect. I had loved the movies for so long that I was just a little bit scared that the books weren't going to live up to that. To me, I just didn't know, because I've heard both people that loved them and I've heard from people that really dislike them and dislike Tolkien's writing style and just didn't vibe with them at all. So I wasn't sure, but I'm really, really glad that I ended up loving them, because now I not only have the movies to return to and look back on that I really love, but now I have the books and I can experience the story this way as well. I think Tolkien's prose is incredible. I love the language he chooses to use to describe any given scene. He's another author on this list that just makes his books feel so magical. He can make things feel so heavy and important, but also light at the same time. His dialogue is really good. His scene setting is great. His action is exciting. I also loved all the characters in these books. I don't think there was a single character that I disliked or found disinteresting. And mind you, there were a lot of characters. I even found some of the characters that I liked the portrayal of in the books more than the movies. For example, Frodo, Éomer, Éowyn, Faramir, Legolas, Gimli. I think that's all I can think of, just to name a few. I also love the relationship between the Fellowship. I thought they had a really fun dynamic. They went through this whole harrowing journey together, and I love them all. The plot of the books was so good too. Obviously, the world building is really masterful. I like the character arcs of everyone, especially the hobbits, who are seeing so much of Middle Earth, so much that's new to them. I loved their journey of journeying. I even read the appendices after The Return of the King, and I loved those as well. Even Tolkien writing a pretty dry thing like those is still riveting to me. So overall, after reading these books, I can absolutely see why they are so beloved. I'm so excited to do rereads of them. I want to get back in there and see everything that I missed, especially now that I've read the Silmarillion, so I have more context for the world, and I'll just have these little things now that I can pick up on. Lord of the Rings is just the best. Probably one of my favorite book series, just stories of all time. It is fantastic. And I absolutely can see why Lord of the Rings is so influential. It's just extraordinary. So that's my list. That is my top 10 favorite books that I read in 2023. I read so many incredible things. Every single book on this list, I could probably list as a favorite book of all time. Like, I had such a great reading year last year. I'm really excited for 2024, honestly. So anyways, I've yelled at you enough about these books that I've loved. I'd recommend all of them. If you had a favorite book or multiple books that you read in 2023, I'd love to know, because I need to make my TBR longer. I shouldn't. It's already long enough, but like, what the hell? If you have opinions about any of these books that I had on this list, let me know. I'd love to hear what they are, even if you disagree. I just want to know. Anyways, that's all for me this time. Until next time, just have a really great day. Farewell.